Karen tries to kick service dog off plane, gets escorted out instead. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you like this story, don't forget to subscribe. The airport was a chaos of noise, movement, and frenetic energy as the peak holiday season pushed through its busiest point. The constant hum of flight announcements, the clinking sound of rolling luggage, and the murmur of dozens of conversations mixed with the distant buzz of overhead fluorescent lights. Families and travelers of all sorts moved hurriedly through the terminal, with some stopping to grab a quick snack or a last-minute gift for loved ones. Security lines were long, tempers were short, and the atmosphere seemed thick with impatience as passengers jockeyed for space, checking and double-checking their boarding passes as though the slightest slip would cause them to miss their flights. The general air of anxiety seemed to settle on everyone like a heavy cloak, but amidst it all, a quiet tension was growing in the gate area, brewing unnoticed at first. In the midst of the chaos, a disabled veteran and his service dog moved through the terminal with a sense of quiet purpose. The man was in his early 40s, wearing a crisp military jacket with the subtle insignia of his service displayed on the lapel. His steps were steady but slow, the weight of his body leaning slightly on a cane in his right hand as he made his way toward the boarding area. His eyes were calm but tired, and the faint lines around his eyes spoke of years of service, experiences that had worn him down, yet also built him up in ways that few would understand. Beside him, walking in perfect step, was a large, calm golden retriever. The dog, fully trained as a service animal, wore a vest marked with a prominent service dog insignia. Its movements were almost fluid, a model of discipline and focus, perfectly attuned to the needs of its handler. As they approached the gate, the dog kept its focus ahead, its tail wagging gently but not aggressively. The veteran stopped briefly to check the status of his flight, giving the dog a small pat on the head. His demeanor was one of quiet confidence, a reminder that his service dog wasn't just a companion but a necessary part of his day-to-day life, providing him with the support and assistance he needed. The gate area was, as expected, crowded. People shuffled in all directions, trying to find their assigned seats or rushing to the counter for last-minute gate changes or questions about baggage. There was a palpable impatience in the air, as if everyone was rushing to get to their destinations without being delayed by the chaos surrounding them. The veteran took his place in line, moving toward the counter, and as he did, the dog settled obediently at his feet, its posture relaxed yet ready to spring into action should the need arise. The other passengers in line paid little attention to the man and his service dog, absorbed in their own world of last-minute preparations or distracted by the hum of the overhead announcements. However, one woman standing near the front of the line noticed them immediately. She was in her mid-40s, tall, with sharply styled hair and an air of obvious entitlement. Her gaze fell on the veteran and his service dog, and her face immediately contorted into a mask of distaste. She was Karen, though she didn't seem to notice or care that her presence was a disruption to the peaceful atmosphere. From the moment her eyes locked onto the dog, she began to mumble under her breath, her face wrinkling further in irritation. It was clear she was not going to be quiet about her discomfort. Karen's muttering soon turned into a loud complaint, as she pointed toward the dog and then to the airline staff at the counter, demanding to speak with someone immediately. "Excuse me," Karen called sharply, her voice cutting through the low hum of the terminal. "That dog can't be here. I have severe allergies, and that thing is making my throat close up. You need to remove it right now." Her words were forceful, and her body language radiated impatience and self-righteousness. She was clearly expecting immediate action, believing that her discomfort was enough to justify removing a working service animal from the flight. The staff member at the counter, an experienced flight attendant with a calm demeanor, turned toward Karen and then to the veteran and his dog. "Ma'am, I assure you that this is a certified service dog," the attendant said politely. "The law allows for service dogs to accompany their handlers on the plane, and there are accommodations in place for passengers with allergies. We can certainly offer you an alternate seat if that would help." But Karen was not having it. Her reaction was swift, her frustration only growing by the second. "I don't care what your law says," she snapped, her voice rising. "I have allergies so severe that I could go into anaphylactic shock. You can't expect me to sit next to that animal. I demand you take it off the plane immediately." Her words were laced with an intensity that caught the attention of several nearby passengers, who looked on in both confusion and mild disbelief. Some passengers exchanged glances, trying to figure out if they were witnessing a real emergency or just another case of entitled behavior gone unchecked. The veteran, who had remained calm up until now, turned to face Karen. His expression was stern but not angry, and he raised a hand to calm the dog, which had begun to shift slightly at the tension in the air. "Ma'am," he said, his voice measured, "this dog is a trained service animal. It's not going anywhere." His words were simple, direct, and respectful, but Karen wasn't listening. Her eyes narrowed as she squared up to him, continuing her tirade. "I don't care what kind of service it's providing," she scoffed. "I'm not going to sit here and risk my health because you people refuse to take responsibility for your passengers. You need to make a decision now, or I'll be forced to report this." The veteran stood his ground, offering a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. His eyes remained unwavering as he glanced toward the flight attendants, signaling them that he had this under control, at least for the moment. But Karen was relentless, and her complaints only grew louder, now demanding to speak with a supervisor. She started to make a scene, raising her voice and causing a stir among the other passengers, many of whom were now visibly uncomfortable with the confrontation. As the airline staff began to gather around, trying to defuse the situation, the veteran quietly took a step back, the dog obediently following his lead. He knew what was coming next. He had been through similar encounters before, though it always seemed to catch people off guard when they tried to challenge the legitimacy of his service dog. He could feel his pulse quicken, but his exterior remained calm. He was used to dealing with such nonsense. What unsettled him, though, was how easily Karen could turn her discomfort into an aggressive demand, one that threatened to derail the entire boarding process. The flight attendants exchanged glances and, after a brief discussion, the senior staff member made her way over, her steps deliberate and firm. She nodded to the veteran, signaling that they were taking charge of the situation now. "Ma'am," she said, her tone calm but stern, "I've already explained that this is a certified service dog. We understand your concerns, but we cannot remove the animal. However, if you're feeling unwell, we're happy to assist you in finding another seat, or we can provide other accommodations. But we cannot delay this flight for an unnecessary request." This wasn't going to be the smooth resolution Karen had anticipated. She was already growing more irritated, and her demand was no longer just about the dog. She wanted control, and she was prepared to escalate the situation, no matter the cost. What she didn't expect was what happened next. Karen's frustration only continued to mount as the veteran's calm demeanor seemed to only infuriate her more. Her voice grew louder, filled with a sense of self-importance, and she began waving her arms in exasperation, gesturing toward the dog with exaggerated movements, as though it were an enemy she needed to combat rather than an animal providing assistance. "This is ridiculous," she shouted. "I can't believe you're letting a dog take precedence over my health. You don't care about allergies, do you? You just care about following some stupid policy." Her words carried across the gate area, drawing the attention of more passengers, some of whom were now beginning to shift uneasily in their seats, while others muttered among themselves, trying to make sense of the situation. The veteran remained silent, standing at ease with his dog by his side. His composure never wavered, though his eyes betrayed a flicker of annoyance at the way the scene was escalating. He had encountered moments like this before, instances where people mistook his disability for a personal inconvenience, or worse, used their own discomfort as an excuse to challenge the legitimacy of his service dog. He had learned not to react hastily, not to feed into the anger that was so evident in Karen's voice. Instead, he allowed his presence to be a grounding force, his stillness contrasting sharply with her increasing agitation. But it was becoming clear that Karen wasn't going to back down. Her voice cracked through the air again, sharper this time. "I demand that you get me off this flight. I'm not going to risk my health because you're too incompetent to follow basic protocol." Karen was no longer trying to be reasonable, she was issuing a command, as though everyone around her was obligated to comply. The passengers nearby exchanged uncomfortable glances, many of them choosing to ignore her, but a few looked on with evident concern. It was as if the whole gate area had become a stage, and Karen had claimed the spotlight. The veteran, still silent, took a small step back. He could feel the heat of the crowd's gaze on him, but he remained unflustered. His focus shifted to his dog, which had not flinched or reacted in the slightest. The service animal's calm presence was a testament to its training, something the veteran appreciated more than anyone could understand. He had learned to rely on the dog not just for physical assistance but for emotional stability as well, especially during moments like these when his patience was being tested. He tried to center himself, taking a slow, deep breath as Karen continued to rail against the flight attendants. By this point, a supervisor had arrived at the gate, drawn by the noise and confusion. A tall woman in her early 50s, with a professional air about her, approached the scene with a sense of authority that could not be ignored. Her uniform was immaculate, her demeanor calm but firm. She assessed the situation in a matter of moments, her eyes flicking between Karen and the veteran, before settling on the flight attendants. "What's going on here?" she asked, her voice smooth yet demanding an answer. The flight attendant closest to Karen stepped forward and explained the situation briefly. "Ma'am, this is a certified service dog. The passenger here is a disabled veteran, and the dog is necessary for his mobility and well-being. We've already offered you an alternative seat to avoid any discomfort, but you've insisted on having the dog removed. We cannot accommodate that request as it's a violation of airline policy." The supervisor nodded, her face impassive as she listened, though her expression didn't change much as Karen immediately cut in, her voice high-pitched and filled with indignation. "That's not good enough." Karen spat. "Do you think I'm going to sit next to an animal that could kill me? I don't care what your policies say. I'm entitled to a safe flight, and you're denying me that by letting this thing on board." She threw her arms wide, gesturing to the dog, as if it were some sort of dangerous beast. The other passengers, who had been trying to avoid getting involved, now began to whisper among themselves, glancing nervously at the exchange. The discomfort in the air was palpable, and some people were visibly uncomfortable with the way Karen was behaving. The supervisor, despite the rising tension, remained composed. "Ma'am," she began in the same calm, measured tone, "we understand that allergies can be a serious issue, but this is a trained service animal. It is legally allowed to accompany its handler. We can offer you another seat farther away, or if that doesn't work for you, we can rebook you on a later flight." But Karen's eyes narrowed as she refused to listen, now standing firmly with her arms crossed over her chest, her expression one of utter defiance. "No," she said flatly, "I'm not going anywhere until that dog is gone. You're putting my life in danger, and I won't let you get away with it." The veteran, still silent, shook his head suddenly, signaling to the flight attendants that they had done all they could to placate the situation. But it was clear Karen wasn't interested in compromising. Her words were beginning to spiral, and her voice became increasingly frantic. She started pacing back and forth, muttering under her breath, pointing toward the dog every few seconds and ranting about her supposed allergies. Her movements were jerky, her eyes wide with frustration, and the passengers could no longer ignore the scene unfolding before them. It was at that moment that the supervisor's expression shifted, the corners of her mouth tightening slightly as she realized that Karen's outbursts weren't just a matter of inconvenience. Karen's refusal to calm down, her absolute disregard for the rules, and her unwillingness to consider alternative solutions meant that things were escalating quickly. The situation was no longer just about a dog, it was about an unreasonable passenger trying to disrupt the flight for everyone else. With a sharp gesture, the supervisor signaled to the security personnel standing at the gate. The veteran, who had remained calm throughout the ordeal, felt a slight sense of relief as he saw the security guards approach. Though he didn't want to see anyone escorted off the flight, it was becoming clear that Karen was not going to back down without a more direct intervention. Her actions had already caused enough of a scene, and the disruption to the boarding process had been significant. The security guards, 2 men in their late 30s, walked over with a quiet confidence. They stood behind the supervisor for a moment, assessing the situation before one of them spoke. "Ma'am," he said, his voice firm but respectful, "you're creating a disruption, and you need to calm down or we'll have to escort you off the plane." At this, Karen's face twisted into a mask of outrage. "You're kicking me off the plane," she screeched. "For what? For standing up for my rights?" She took a step back, her chest heaving as her emotions continued to boil over. "This is unbelievable. I'm not going anywhere until that dog is gone." The supervisor, unfazed, nodded toward the security guards. "Please escort her off the plane," she instructed, her voice steady and authoritative. And with that, the situation took a sharp turn. The veteran's dog, sensing the tension in the air, stayed by his side, perfectly composed as the staff began to handle Karen's escalating behavior. As the security guard stepped forward, Karen's eyes widened in disbelief. Her hands shot out, as though she could ward them off, but it was clear she was already outmatched. The scene had reached its breaking point. The gate area had gone from awkward discomfort to outright chaos, with all eyes now on Karen as the security personnel calmly, but firmly, guided her toward the exit. As Karen was escorted away, she continued to shout, her voice fading with each step. "This isn't over," she yelled, though no one seemed to be listening. The flight attendants exchanged glances, their expressions a mixture of relief and professionalism. The veteran, finally able to take a deep breath, turned to face the flight crew, offering a small nod of thanks for their handling of the situation. And with that, the flight, which had seemed on the verge of being delayed indefinitely, was finally back on track. The veteran's dog, still at his side, offered a gentle nudge as though offering reassurance. The chaos was over, and the flight was once again set to depart on time. But the echoes of Karen's outburst would remain in the minds of everyone who had witnessed it. The commotion of Karen's outburst gradually faded as she was escorted from the plane, her voice still echoing in the hallway as security guided her away. The gate area, which had been tense and filled with whispers just moments before, slowly began to settle back into a quieter rhythm. Passengers returned to their conversations, though there was a palpable sense of relief in the air, as if everyone had collectively exhaled after the storm had passed. The veteran, who had remained composed through the ordeal, exhaled a long breath, his shoulders loosening slightly. His dog, sensing the shift in the atmosphere, remained at his side, its head tilted up with a quiet intelligence, as if understanding the weight of the situation. The veteran absent-mindedly scratched the dog's ear, a small gesture of thanks for the unwavering support it had provided throughout the entire scene. It wasn't the first time his service dog had stood by him in moments of difficulty, and it certainly wouldn't be the last. The veteran allowed himself a brief moment of peace, grateful that the situation hadn't escalated further. The flight attendants, who had been working tirelessly to defuse the situation, now turned their attention back to the rest of the passengers. One of them, a woman with short brown hair, approached the veteran, offering a warm, apologetic smile. "I'm sorry about all of that, sir. We appreciate your patience," she said, her tone genuine but tinged with the stress of the recent encounter. The veteran gave her a nod, his expression softening slightly as he acknowledged her words. "It's no problem," he replied, his voice calm but carrying a quiet edge of weariness. He understood the challenges the airline staff had faced, trying to balance the needs of one passenger with the safety and comfort of everyone else on board. It wasn't an easy job, and he appreciated the professionalism they had shown in handling the situation. The attendant gave a small smile and then glanced at the dog, which was still lying obediently at the veteran's feet, its golden fur gleaming under the terminal lights. "He's such a well-behaved dog," she remarked, a subtle warmth in her voice as she acknowledged the animal's role in the whole ordeal. The veteran chuckled softly, his gaze softening as he looked at his companion. "He's been through a lot with me," he said, his words carrying an unspoken depth. "And he's the best partner I could ask for." There was a brief silence between them, an unspoken understanding of what had just transpired and the unspoken bond between a service dog and its handler. As the attendant walked away to check on the rest of the boarding process, the veteran stood still for a moment longer, taking in the calm that had descended after the chaos. He shifted his weight slightly, feeling the familiar ache in his joints that often accompanied his condition, but it was a minor annoyance compared to the storm he had just weathered. He felt a sense of relief wash over him, knowing that Karen's disruptive behavior had been dealt with and that he could now focus on what was truly important, getting to his destination. The boarding process resumed without further incident, and passengers slowly began to file onto the plane. The noise and bustle of the terminal faded into the background as the veteran and his dog made their way to the gate agent's desk. The agent, who had been working on her computer, looked up with a small smile and checked their boarding passes. "Thank you for your patience," she said, her voice warm and polite. The veteran returned the smile with a small nod, grateful for her professionalism despite the earlier chaos. She handed them their tickets, and the veteran made his way toward the boarding tunnel, the dog following closely by his side. As he walked through the tunnel, he couldn't help but overhear snippets of conversation from passengers behind him. Many were still talking about the scene that had just unfolded, their voices hushed but filled with disbelief. Some were expressing their sympathy for the veteran, while others seemed to be discussing Karen's outburst with a mixture of incredulity and judgment. The veteran couldn't help but feel a twinge of irritation at the thought of being the subject of their whispered conversations, but he quickly pushed it aside. He had long since learned to tune out the judgmental whispers of others, especially when they came from people who had no idea what he had been through. His focus was on the journey ahead, not on the opinions of those around him. He boarded the plane, feeling the familiar rush of anticipation that always came before takeoff. The flight attendants were still moving through the aisles, helping passengers stow their bags and ensuring everyone was settled in for the flight. As the veteran found his seat, he noticed a few curious glances directed his way, but for the most part, people seemed eager to put the earlier disturbance behind them. He sat down carefully, his joints aching from the long walk, and gestured for the dog to settle beside him. The dog curled up on the floor at his feet, its head resting on its paws as it gave a soft sigh of contentment. The plane began to fill up, and the familiar hum of conversation gradually grew louder, though it was nowhere near the level of the chaos from before. The veteran settled into his seat, adjusting his position slightly to ease the discomfort in his back. He had learned to adapt to the discomfort over the years, to find ways to manage the pain that had become a constant companion in his life. But despite the physical challenges, there was a sense of peace that came with being on the plane. It was the calm before the storm of the holidays, a brief moment of respite before the chaos of the season took hold once again. As the plane's engines roared to life and the familiar vibrations began to fill the cabin, the veteran closed his eyes for a moment, allowing himself to relax into the seat. His thoughts drifted, momentarily escaping the events of the past few hours. He thought of his family, the people waiting for him at the other end of the flight. He thought of the dog, always by his side, providing a steady presence that allowed him to navigate the world with a little more ease. And he thought of the encounter with Karen, a small chapter in his life that, though unpleasant, had been handled with the same calm determination that had gotten him through countless other challenges. The flight attendants began their pre-flight safety demonstration, and the veteran opened his eyes, returning his focus to the present moment. He had no desire to dwell on the confrontation any longer. What mattered now was the journey ahead, and the people waiting for him at his destination. With a deep breath, he settled back into his seat, feeling the tension in his body slowly release as the plane began its ascent into the sky. The noise of the engines drowned out all other sounds, and for a few moments, the veteran felt the weight of the world slip away. In the end, it was just another story to add to the long list of encounters he had faced over the years, an encounter with a woman who, for reasons known only to her, had chosen to make a scene over a matter that could have been easily resolved with understanding and respect. He had learned long ago that such people existed, and that their actions were often more a reflection of their own struggles than anything to do with him. So, with the calmness that he had cultivated over time, he turned his attention to the horizon ahead, knowing that there would always be more obstacles to face. But for now, he was on his way to his destination, and that was all that mattered. The plane steadily ascended into the sky, its engines roaring to life as it climbed higher, leaving the earth and the chaos of the airport far behind. The veteran settled deeper into his seat, his body relaxing as the familiar hum of the aircraft filled the cabin. For a moment, it felt as though the entire world had faded into a distant memory, his focus shifting entirely to the present, the quiet companionship of his dog by his side, and the steady rhythm of the flight. His mind drifted, but not with the chaotic thoughts of earlier. Instead, he felt a sense of calm returning, one he hadn't fully realized he'd lost until the turbulence of Karen's outburst had passed. As the plane leveled off, the flight attendants continued their duties, moving smoothly through the cabin, offering drinks and checking on passengers. The atmosphere was back to the usual rhythm of air travel, the quiet murmur of voices blending with the soft clink of cups and the rustle of magazines being flipped open. But the veteran noticed something this time, something different. He observed the way people looked at him, their gazes often lingering a little longer than usual, some with subtle glances of sympathy, others perhaps with a silent understanding. But there was no judgment now. The tension had left the air, and it seemed the passengers were more willing to give him space, to respect the unspoken code of quiet acknowledgement. It was a far cry from the hostility that Karen had brought with her, and for the first time in a long while, he felt as though the world was giving him a brief reprieve. His dog, settled at his feet, occasionally shifted in its spot, a soft sigh escaping as it readjusted its position. The animal's presence was like a steadying anchor, always there when the world seemed too loud, too overwhelming. The dog had been his companion through the most difficult parts of his life, providing comfort when words failed, and silently standing by when everything else seemed to fall apart. He had no idea where he would be without the dog, but for now, it was enough to simply exist in this moment, the stillness of the plane and the quiet companionship of the animal offering a rare sense of peace. The flight continued smoothly, the hours stretching ahead, and the veteran allowed himself to drift in and out of light sleep. He thought of the holidays ahead, the family waiting for him, the reunion that had brought him on this flight in the first place. It was a brief moment of normalcy, something he didn't take for granted, especially given the nature of his job and the years spent serving in ways that few could truly understand. There were many things about his life that had changed over time, and many that had stayed the same, but it was moments like this, quiet, simple, and unhurried, that reminded him of the things that truly mattered. A few hours into the flight, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their approach to the destination. The veteran straightened up slightly, adjusting his position as the plane began its descent. His thoughts, which had drifted during the flight, now shifted once again, this time to the arrival. He couldn't help but think of the absurdity of the situation earlier, of how something as small as Karen's refusal to understand had spiraled into such an unnecessary scene. It wasn't the first time he had dealt with entitled individuals, but it was a reminder of how deeply some people could be affected by things that had no real bearing on their lives. In some ways, he understood Karen. He didn't condone her actions, but he understood her. People like her, the ones who believed the world should bend to their will, often came from a place of deep insecurity, a place where their discomfort became more important than the reality of others. She had assumed, in her arrogance, that her discomfort was the only factor that mattered. It was a mindset he had seen many times before in his line of work, people who believed that their personal struggles outweighed the needs of everyone around them. But for all his understanding, the veteran couldn't help but feel that her actions were, in the end, self-defeating. In trying to assert her dominance over the situation, she had only exposed her own weaknesses, and the reality of the situation had turned against her. As the plane touched down smoothly on the runway, the veteran felt a slight jolt, followed by the steady rumble of the wheels against the tarmac. He took a deep breath as the aircraft slowed, the finality of the journey setting in. He was nearing his destination, the place where his family awaited, the place where he could finally put the chaos of the past few hours behind him. He wasn't sure why the events had affected him so deeply, perhaps because they had interrupted a moment that was supposed to be peaceful, or perhaps because he had expected more understanding from those around him. But whatever the reason, it was over now, and as the plane taxied toward the gate, he felt a sense of relief that he hadn't anticipated. When the plane came to a stop, the usual hum of passengers collecting their things and preparing to disembark filled the air. The veteran stood slowly, feeling the familiar stiffness in his joints as he rose from his seat. His dog stood up with him, ever obedient, and the two of them made their way toward the aisle. As they approached the door, the flight attendants offered smiles and nods, their faces more relaxed than they had been earlier in the flight. They had done their job, handled the situation with grace, and now the veteran could finally leave the plane without the burden of any further confrontation. Stepping off the plane, he was met with the familiar buzz of the airport terminal. People hurried by, moving in all directions as they went about their business. The veteran barely noticed them, his focus now solely on the exit ahead, on the family that awaited him just beyond the security checkpoint. But as he walked through the terminal, something unexpected happened. A few people who had been on the flight caught his eye. They smiled at him, offering nods of acknowledgement, as if to silently show their support for how he had handled the situation earlier. It wasn't much, just a brief moment of human connection, but for the veteran, it was enough. It was a reminder that there were still people in the world who valued understanding, who saw beyond the surface and recognized when someone was simply trying to do the right thing. The reunion with his family was everything he had hoped for. Hugs were exchanged, laughter filled the air, and the chaos of the airport, of Karen's outburst, was quickly forgotten in the warmth of homecoming. The veteran's dog, as always, stayed by his side, its presence a constant reminder of the journey they had shared together, of the countless moments they had faced, both difficult and triumphant. As they left the terminal, the weight of the world seemed to lift from his shoulders, replaced by the comfort of familiar faces and the quiet joy of simply being home. The ordeal with Karen, in the end, was just a small blip in the veteran's life, a fleeting moment of confrontation in an otherwise peaceful existence. But it had served as a reminder of something important, that no matter the obstacles we face, no matter the disruptions caused by others, we are always in control of how we respond. It was a lesson the veteran had learned long ago, one that he carried with him every day, and one that would continue to guide him through whatever challenges the future might bring. For now, though, he allowed himself to be present, to embrace the joy of the moment, knowing that the journey, both literal and metaphorical, was far from over.